We see that identity versus role confusion really starts in adolescence. So, teens trying to figure out, who am I? What do I want to be when I grow up? What hobbies interest me, etc. But we also see that this stage can persist lifelong. And we'll talk about that more in adulthood, but you may have different periods of life where you have this role confusion. And do I like the job that I'm in? Do I like where my life is going? Do I like X, Y, or Z? And we see that adults can come back to this identity versus role confusion throughout adulthood. James Marcia came up with these terms: identity diffusion, foreclosure, and moratorium. Basically, identity diffusion is a time where you're not really looking for who you are, you're just kind of going through the day to day process of being. You're not seeking out new information, you're not looking to decide anything about your identity at the moment. You're just in the moment. Foreclosure is when people really just subscribe to the ideologies and the expectations of their parents. So you see this often with religious identity, with sometimes vocational identity, particularly if your parents have told you since you were a child, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to go into the family business, whatever options you have there. And you just take those at face value and you say, okay, I am this, I am that, because it's who my parents are, it's who my parents want me to be. You don't really look into your options. Moratorium is really just putting off making those decisions. Sometimes you can see here going to college would be a reason for being in moratorium. There are probably other reasons as well, which I'm sure your book talks about more. Erikson really talked about 4 aspects of identity, and these really hold true today. We still, when we talk about identity, it's really along these 4 categories. So you have your religious identity, which is often influenced by both your parents and the community around you. Similarly, your political identity, influenced by your parents and the culture. And we can see these cycle throughout generations. So your religious identity, you may come from a long line of people of the same religion, because we're often influenced by that close family or community that we're a part of. Gender identity is going to be a person's acceptance of the roles and behaviors that society associates with the biological categories of male and female. Sexual orientation is a term that refers to whether a person is sexually and romantically attracted to others of the same sex, the opposite sex, or both sexes. And also our vocational identity. Historically speaking, vocational identity was determined very early on. You would graduate high school, if you would even graduate high school. Once you hit a certain age, you were expected to go into the workforce, and you stayed in that job until you retired. We really don't see that as frequently anymore. It often takes years to acquire the skills needed for many careers. If you peruse any job boards, you'll often run into positions that say minimum 3 to 5 years experience, minimum 10 years experience, and so on. There are a lot of jobs that don't necessarily want to train their staff or get them up to speed. They want them to already have these base skills and knowledge. Also, we do see that teenage employment can often interfere with school, particularly if they're working, I think it's more than like 15 or 20 hours a week. We see that grades sharply decline because their focus and concern and where all their effort is going to is not the job often. Family conflict is really interesting because we do see that parents and their teenagers, the conflict and the fights and the arguments really tend to peak in early adolescence. It hurts a lot of parents' feelings, and it's really interesting to see them once they understand that it is more of a sign of attachment to fight with your parent. So I'll give you an example. You have a teenager who is fighting constantly with her parent. The parent doesn't understand why. Teenager spends all day at school. Maybe they got up late that day. Maybe they forgot they had a test that day. Maybe they got in a fight with their friend or their partner, or they were worried about their job or their extracurriculars or whatever the situation may be. They have a lot of stress on their shoulders and they just want to blow up at someone. But what happens if you blow up at your friend or your partner? They don't really have that biological attachment to you, so they're just going to leave you. If they don't like something about you, and this is particularly important in adolescence when you think that everyone's watching you and judging you and concerned about you, you don't know how to deal with all that pressure. So you go home and then maybe you blow up at your parent and fight with them, even if it's over something silly. And it's really subconscious. The teenager doesn't even realize that they're doing it, but really, your parent isn't going to leave you. They're always going to be there for you. So this is just one way that the child is maybe oddly showing their love, even if no one at the moment realizes it. They know that you're always going to be there, so you can get all your anger and aggression out, and the parent is still going to be there. A major challenge for developmentalists is to combine direct and practical programs that benefit adolescents with laboratory analysis of molecular genetics. You can see here in this study, some of the kids have done all three. So drunk alcohol, smoked marijuana, and had sex. And many had done at least two of these. As you see, for those youths without genetic risk, the usual parenting was no better or worse than the parenting that benefited from the special classes. The average 14-year-old in either group had tried only one risky behavior, but for those at genetic risk, the special program made a decided difference. Adolescents are more dependent on their parents if they are female and or from a minority ethnic group. This can be either repressive or healthy, depending on the culture and the specific circumstances. For 30 years, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey has asked high school students from all over the United States dozens of confidential questions about their behavior. As you can see, about 1/4 of all students have already had sex by the 9th grade, and more than 1/3 have not yet had sex by their senior year, a group whose ranks have been increasing in recent years. Other research finds that sexual behaviors are influenced by peers, with some groups all sexually experienced by age 14 and others not until age 18 or older. I think we've already discussed that we are seeing less sex in all age groups across the board over the last 10 or so years. However, we do see an uptick in sexting, an uptick, possibly because this really wasn't an option, 15 years ago. But we do also see some of these things here. So with kids who are sexting, they are more likely to report having had sex. You can see in this chart here that most people are becoming more accepting of same-sex marriage. Even much older adults from the silent generation have significantly come around in the last decade or so. So where are kids learning about sex? Largely, they're learning about sex from the media. So you get information from the news, from the TV shows that you watch. Whether right or wrong, this is what they're seeing. So that what they're exposed to in the media. Also from their parents. Oftentimes parents are timid or hesitant to have this conversation with their children, and so what we do see is that the communication, if there is some, it's often an incomplete picture where they're not giving all the information, only what's comfortable to the parent. We also know that kids learn about sex from their peers and from their teachers, particularly if there is a sex education or a health education course that teaches sex. Typically, in many states, still there is an abstinence only approach, but that doesn't teach safe sex. So then once people do have sex, oftentimes they don't know some of the risks or consequences because they haven't been taught. There are many causes of depression in adolescence. Particularly, there could be genetic causes, how they were cared for early on as a child, puberty, hormones, and really just an individual vulnerability. Completed suicide is rare in adolescence, but serious thoughts about killing oneself are frequent. Depression and parasuicide are more common in girls than in boys, but rates are high even in boys. There are 3 reasons to suspect that the rates for boys are underestimated. Boys tend to be less aware of their emotions than girls are. Boys consider it unmanly to try to kill themselves and to fail. And completed suicide is also higher in males than in females. Your book talks about these 3 signs that predict delinquency: stubbornness, shoplifting, and bullying. I will say the number one predictor of delinquent behavior is aggression. It's actually none of these 3. We do see kids who are more aggressive are more likely to be arrested as adolescents and also to be further arrested once they're an adult. Cigarettes, alcohol, and many prescription medicines are just as addictive and damaging as illegal drugs such as cocaine and heroin. By asking the same questions year after year, the Monitoring the Future study shows notable historical effects. It is encouraging that something in society, not in the adolescent, makes drug use increase and decrease, and that the most recent data show a continued decline in the drug most commonly abused, which is alcohol. This study includes the use of amphetamines, sedatives or barbiturates, narcotics other than heroin, or tranquilizers without a doctor's prescription.